Minister of Finance.
That's not what he called first.
Oh,
Mr. Macdonald's what he called.
member from Fredericton Silverwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's a pleasure to rise in the House today to support Bill 88, an act to amend the Civil Service Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, the first question I want to establish is why are we doing this? Why have I proposed this motion, this bill? Well, the goal is, first of all, to fix an obvious gap in the legislation that was left by prior amendments. But most importantly, Mr. Speaker, the goal here is to provide priority hiring for our modern veterans. Now, historically, this Act has always contained provisions for priority hiring. In fact, since 1943, there were provisions in this Act to provide veterans with priority hiring. At that time, the definition that was offered a veteran related to war service in the First World War and the Second World War, as you can well imagine would be the case in 1943. And then the Act has evolved over time, and most recently the revisions added the Korean War, and provisions for priority hiring for First World War veterans, of course, were taken out. And as you can well imagine, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that in modern times, there are no Second World War veterans or Korean veterans that are applying for this benefit. And so, in 2009, amendments were introduced that effectively did some housekeeping and removed the definition of veteran. But what it did was, by taking the definition out in Clause 10.1, it left the provisions in Clause 10.2 for priority hiring inactive. And I'm told that at that time the intent was to fix the definition in regulation, but that never happened. And so, Mr. Speaker, that's why I'm proposing today's bill. That's a little bit of the history of it. But I think another important history to consider is the history of how a veteran is defined. Now, Mr. Speaker, as I've come to learn through the last 3.5 years in working to bring this bill forward, it was something that I identified early on that I wanted to do. I found that actually coming to a definition can be quite a difficult thing. And so to do this, I reached out to all the different various veterans groups within the province of New Brunswick. And we had a little consultation, and that's largely is what's reflected in today's Act. But it's important to note the concept of veteran has changed over time. And immediately following the Second World War, there was a fairly tight definition of veterans. And in fact, if you look at the history of the Royal Canadian Legion, which was formed coming out of the First World War, often when the Second World War veterans got to the Legion, they were not necessarily always welcome. And that was because the First World War veterans sort of had pride of place. And we've seen this in a lot of different definitions of veteran over time, that some veterans groups are kind of hold themselves sort of sacred, I should say. And so over time, we've seen the definition of veteran evolve. In particular, a few of the important breakthroughs were the veterans of the Korean War. I was proud to see that included in our Act previously. And the Korean War veterans, following as they did on the heels of the Second World War, often were felt to be second-class citizens. They felt that they weren't treated properly. And it took them many years to earn status as veterans, to receive the decorations and medals that they deserved. And finally included in all things veteran. And similarly, the Merchant Marine. The Merchant Marine fought for years, and it was only very recently that they were included as veterans of the Second World War. So there's a long history and tradition of veterans trying to sort of meet the bar, as it were, to be included in the veterans community. Now, when I came to, when I was luckily sworn in as an MLA in this House, and when I assumed my duties as Legislative Secretary for Military Affairs, I had a look at all the pieces of legislation that we had in the province of New Brunswick and all of the things that affected veterans. Did a little bit of an inventory. And this one popped out because it was quite clear that the definition had been removed, and there was literally a gap in the legislation. The paragraph that dealt with the definition in the current legislation is actually empty. Those paragraphs have been repealed. And therefore, this provision is not functioning. And so it caused me to examine this question of what is a veteran. Now, really, there are three, in modern veterans, the modern veterans perspective is that there are sort of three different ways of looking at it. There is the British model, which is an all-inclusive model. Basically, anyone who puts on the uniform is considered a veteran under the British model. So that was one option. There's also, on the other extreme, there's the Australian model. If you look at Australian legislation, you'll see a very clearly defined and codified set of operations. So an Australian veteran needs to be someone who's in the military but who has deployed to one of the listed theaters of war or theaters of operations. So their definition is very much based upon that expeditionary service, and it's very codified in the legislation. And then the third general international model is the U.S. model, an American model, which tends to refer to years of service. So if you do a certain number of years of service, then you're considered a veteran. So, as I say, I felt it was important to consult with the veterans community on this, and so we had a meeting to discuss the general concept of veteran and how we should define it in this Act and in other acts. And so we consulted with the Royal Canadian Legion, the New Brunswick Command, the ANAVETS, the Army, Navy, and Air Force veterans. We consulted individually with Second World War veterans, notably Mr. Martin and Justice Dixon, who is well known to this House. We consulted the Blue Helmets peacekeepers, of course, the Department of National Defence broadly, the Minister's Office, and indeed the commander here, the commander of Base Gagetown. We consulted the Royal New Brunswick Regiment for their perspective as reservists, and also the North Shore Regiment Association. We consulted the Veterans UN NATO Canada, the New Brunswick branch, of course the Canadian Army motorcycle veterans as well. So we really did consult fairly widely. We also consulted with the staff from Veterans Affairs Canada and National Defence, who have a fair amount of expertise in defining this. We also reached out to other organizations that support veterans, such as the True Patriot Love Foundation, Helmets to Hard Hats, and the Veterans Transition Network. And these were able to give us a little bit of input on sort of the academic side of a definition. So what we wanted to do was develop a simple definition, relatively simple, that we could apply going forward across all of the things in the government of New Brunswick that benefits veterans, so that we could apply that to license plates, we could apply that to the Helmets to Hard Hats program, so that here in New Brunswick we would have one definition of veteran that would suit all purposes. So that was the intent of this, and we see it today reflected in these amendments, but our intent is further throughout government to apply this one definition across government. So therefore, the definition needed to be relatively simple, needed to be flexible, it needed to be unifying to reach out to all the various veterans groups. And through the consultation, one of the things that came forward was it needed to address both the regular and primary reserve veterans. So that is in there. Of course, the requirement needed to be that the members were honorably released. That was felt to be very important, of course, and so that is included in the definition. The question came up about length of service, and there was a lot of discussion in the work that we did concerning the length of service and what was appropriate. And the reason that 3 years is offered up in this definition is that that's what's called the basic engagement. So it's here in Canada, that's the minimum amount of time normally that a member would serve upon enrollment. And in that time, 3 years basically gives you enough time to complete all the various stages of your basic training. Of course, the basic training itself doesn't take 3 years, but components of that training to give you your basic qualification can take up to 3 years, or longer in some cases. But it was felt that more or less 3 years would mean that you were fully trained, and therefore that you were deployable. And this was the key element. As I mentioned, the Australian definition is very prescribed, and it describes how veterans would be deployed into which theaters, and that would mean that they're a veteran. Based on our consultations here, we shied away from making that list, and we felt rather that to extend the benefit to someone who had served 3 years meant that they were eligible to be deployed, and that whether they were deployed or not was actually not up to them or not. It was up to the Canadian Forces, to the government, whether or not they would be sent. But 3 years would give them the basic qualification so they were deployable, and that's sort of the main area that was considered. So modern veterans, as I've said, described before, historically veterans have, there's been, in some ways, some friction between veteran groups of different conflicts. But I think that now, in the modern age, veterans are very much more unified, and they see conflict on a spectrum. It's not as clear as perhaps it was in previous wars. In World War I, that the nation was at war. It was clear that the nation was at war, the whole nation was at war, and deployed their army forward, and 1 in 10 Canadians deployed in that war. However, in modern warfare, you have a professional volunteer army that's often deployed into areas of high risk, and their nation remains at peace. And as we've just seen, the end of a 12-year mission in Afghanistan, the reality is that the country of Canada has not been at war. Our Canadian Armed Forces have been at war. Certainly soldiers, sailors, and airmen have deployed into fighting that was as bad as any other previous war, but the nation itself wasn't in war. And in many ways that's a mark of success, certainly, that the professional organization that's dedicated to that end can go away and the rest of the country carries on its normal life. But the reality is that we do put people in harm's way. And we've done that in a lot of different missions. Afghanistan's the most current example, but between the end of the Second World War through the Korean War and then years and years of peacekeeping, there were many Canadians that were deployed into very dangerous zones. And in many ways, that service has not been recognized. So the intent of this legislation is to develop an all-inclusive definition of veterans that reaches out to those various groups that would be affected in the Afghanistan conflict, in peacekeeping missions, and in the missions that are going forward. We don't know what the future holds, and certainly the reality of today's world is there is always conflict, and there's always Canadian interests abroad that need to be protected. And so the reality is that there will probably be Canadian Forces members deployed in future, and this Act would look out for them. It's important, I think, to note that there are members of the Canadian Armed Forces that serve here in Canada and assume great risk. So it's obviously employment overseas is a big part of what the Canadian Forces does, and that's often at great risk to their members. But also here in Canada, there are examples of Canadian Forces members that in fact earn some of the highest decorations for bravery and courage right here in Canada. A great example of those are our search and rescue technicians. These men and women jump out of helicopters into the freezing North Atlantic waters. They go out and rescue fishermen, adventurers, travelers, and that sort of thing, and they're often highly decorated. And it was felt important in the definition to include these members because although they don't deploy offshore, they provide a very important service here in Canada, and that their service is as brave and as courageous as any that deploy overseas. So it was felt that it was very important to include our SARTECs. And there are other examples of that, Mr. Speaker. There are a lot of troops that train and face danger through their training, through the nature of their training, dealing with explosives, dealing with heavy machinery that put themselves in harm's way just to train to be deployable. And so that is one of the reasons that it was felt to include people that are 3 years qualified rather than focus on the operational deployment. Now, it's worth, Mr. Speaker, mentioning the nature of the benefit. And this is important. This is not a blank check. It is a beneficial hiring, a priority hiring clause, which has existed in this Act since 1943. But the reality is it's only after a competition has been conducted. So all of the candidates would have to be fully qualified. They'd have to meet the A-list. They would have passed through the vetting procedure, through an interview procedure, and then at that time, when they're deemed to be on a list of qualified candidates, then they would be given priority hiring. So all things equal, it's the veteran that gets the preference. And indeed, there are other priority hiring provisions within the current legislation, the Equal Employment Opportunities Clause, which I think the Minister will be dealing with a little bit later in detail, but there are other forms of preferential hiring in the Act, and this is consistent with those. And in fact, in some other cases, the preference given to within the EEO program is actually a lot more generous than this provision. But it is important to note that in this provision, there is a competition held, candidates need to be qualified, and once they're deemed to be qualified for the job, the selection procedure would give priority to veterans. And one question that came up in this is, well, should there be a way to triage, say you had 3 or 4 veterans on the list? Well, as I've said already, the employment opportunities, the EEO provision does contain provision for hiring disabled persons, whether they're veterans or not. And so that provision is already stronger than this priority hiring would be. So injured veterans would be covered under that piece. And it was generally felt that once, if you did have a case where there were a number of veterans on an A-list, that then the provision for competition would come back into being. So then it would be a competitive process again. Certainly the feeling was that trying to develop a system that was very structured and triaging different levels of veteran just got way too complicated and didn't serve the end goal. So, Mr. Speaker, why is it important to give veterans jobs? Well, the reality is we don't have that many veterans settling here in New Brunswick. It is a very small number, and a lot of those veterans are already very competitive through the nature of their service. They've distinguished themselves as good employees, and when you talk to employers, they're very glad to have veterans come on board. But one of the best things we can do to help veterans transition out is to give them employment. And as my colleague likes to say quite often, the best social program is a job. And so if we could give veterans a hand up in this case, I think it's very valuable, particularly for our modern veterans. Historically, we had veterans that spent long careers in the military, and so they had long service, and their service was in the military. But increasingly, certainly with the mission in Afghanistan, we've seen Canadians that want to serve. They want to serve and protect their country here and make the world a better place, but they don't necessarily want to adopt a full-time career. And so those people would be eligible for this program. And Mr. Speaker, this is part of a package. We've been lucky to be in this House for 4 years now, and in that time we've had a number of programs that have come forward to support veterans, and this is one more level of that support. And in fact, it ties in very nicely with some of the other programs that we've had before, in particular the Helmets to Hard Hats program, which has provided employment for veterans in the skilled trades, and this program would extend some employment opportunities to veterans in the civil service. So the idea is to build a network of opportunities for veterans to help them transition out. And as I've said, Mr. Speaker, we're not anticipating a huge influx of veterans. The reality is it's a finite number that come to this province, that settled in this province, that are from this province, and this benefit could extend to them and give them great opportunity for their future. Mr. Speaker, it's a real pleasure to stand in the House today to support this bill. It's been a long process. Like I say, I've been working on this now for over 3 years. I'm proud of the final result. It's the result of a lot of consultation within government, consultation with veterans groups around the province, and a number of other key stakeholders. I think that the definition that's offered here meets the requirements, and that is that it extends the benefit to as many veterans as possible, trying to be inclusive rather than exclusive, and adopts a modern definition so that modern veterans can benefit. Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to support this bill on second reading. Thank you very much.